Welcome everyone to Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson, focusing on American foreign policy toward Europe with a special interest in the European security architecture. It's a thrill to host today's event. I'll be moderating a panel discussion amongst three real experts on the European security architecture. And in particular today, we'll be talking about the security situation in Ukraine. Of course, last month, Russia built up its military forces all along the Ukrainian border. The talk was of some 100,000 Russian forces, also made announcements in the Black Sea, in the Kerch Strait and Sea of Azov. And while the immediate security escalation may have abated, of course, this nests in a broader context of 7 years of really Russian aggression against Ukraine, culminating in the annexation of Crimea and continued virtually daily combat between separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, all along the line of contact with Ukraine. The proximate causes for this most recent crisis, or this recent escalation, are unclear. There has been a wide amount of speculation on what caused this Russian move. Some say that it had internal dimensions, that the crisis around Alexei Navalny domestically caused President Putin to move, but there's flagging approval ratings tied to also economic troubles at home in Russia. Others say that in Ukraine, President Zelensky's move against Viktor Medvedchuk or the water crisis in Crimea caused the Russians to act. Others say that there's a new US administration in the United States and that that US administration is being tested just as it is being tested, say, in the South China Sea and in Taiwan. Irrespective of the cause, although we might get into that and some speculation, it clearly launched a flurry of diplomatic and security activity in the West. Tony Blinken, the new American Secretary of State, traveled recently to Brussels. He later moved to Kyiv. The Bucharest Nine met with President Biden and Jens Stoltenberg virtually. I think that was reified by a more recent crisis with the Czech Republic between Prague and Moscow. And the NATO Ukraine Commission met, in which Dmitry Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine, briefed. So to talk about all of these diplomatic maneuvers, the security situation, the immediate crisis, and the broader context of what's happening in Ukraine, I'm really thrilled to have three great panelists with us at Hudson today. Luke Coffey is the director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, another Washington think tank. Before joining Heritage nearly 10 years ago, he served at the UK Ministry of Defense for 2 years as a senior special advisor to then British Defense Secretary Liam Fox. Luke also worked in the House of Commons, the British Parliament, on defense and security matters. And before he worked in British politics, he served in the United States Army as a commissioned officer. He spent his entire time in the Army on active duty overseas. I think he was stationed in Italy with the Army's Southern European Task Force. And in 2005, during his deployment to Afghanistan, he was awarded the Bronze Star. I'm thrilled to have joined today because no discussion like this could just be an American one. It's a Euro-Atlantic conversation, also by David Kattler, who is an American but sits in Brussels. He's Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security, a post he's held since December 2019. In that capacity, he is the Secretary General's senior advisor on these matters. He really has vast experience as an intelligence and a policy specialist at all levels of American government. He helped form and coordinate national policy as Deputy Assistant to the President for Regional Affairs within the American NSC, the National Security Council. He also worked as Senior Advisor to the Director of National Intelligence and was National Intelligence Manager for the Near East. I'm almost tempted to abandon half of this event and ask him all about the crisis in the Middle East today, but that will have to wait for another time. He's also supported combat operations within the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and worked on the Joint Staff as a Deputy Director for Intelligence. He began his career in the Navy. So we have a Navy man and an Army man. I hope it doesn't come to blows on this panel here today. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Ambassador Baiba Braže. She is Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy since May 2020 and is a veteran, almost legendary member of the Latvian Foreign Ministry. She was ambassador to the Court of St. James in London. She was ambassador to the Netherlands. She's held several high-ranking positions within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. Rather than go through all of her illustrious positions in the Latvian Foreign Ministry, I'll just encourage you to visit the NATO website, where you can check out both of their bios and also the Heritage site, which I hate to promote, although it isn't really a rival think tank, to see Luke Coffey's bio. But we'll have a round of opening comments here today of a few minutes by each of our panelists, and then we'll have a wide-ranging conversation digging deeper on that which interests us. So Luke, perhaps we could kick off with you, then move to David Cattler, and then conclude with the ambassador. Luke, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter. And also I want to thank Hudson Institute for inviting me to speak. Heritage and Hudson, we're brothers and sisters, all working for a common cause, I believe. So it's great to collaborate like this and work together. As Peter mentioned in his introduction, in the past few weeks, Russia had conducted a sizable military buildup along its border with Ukraine and in occupied Crimea. Most of these Russian deployments were spontaneous, or so they seemed at the time, and they seemed to be unrelated to any scheduled training exercises that Russia had planned. There were two things, in my opinion, that were notable about this military buildup. Firstly, we now know that many of these military units originated from east of the Ural Mountains. So they had to travel quite far to get to the border with Ukraine. And that was a very costly, expensive exercise, but a very important one in terms of logistics and testing Russian logistics capabilities. The second point that I think is noteworthy is the maritime components. Not only was there a land buildup, there was also a sea buildup in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea that saw ships from the Baltic fleets sail around the Iberian Peninsula and enter the Black Sea to join the existing Russian naval forces there. But also around 15 ships, many of which had amphibious landing capabilities, arrived through the Volga-Don Canal from the Caspian Sea into the Sea of Azov. And while Russia has publicly announced that many of these forces have since been withdrawn, and some land forces have, others haven't, as far as I can tell, the maritime forces that were surged in the past few weeks have remained in the area. So that's a very interesting point to consider, I think, when discussing the situation. Now, Ukraine is in the midst of a national struggle that will determine its geopolitical orientation, that being towards the West or towards Moscow. The outcome of this struggle, in my opinion, will have long-term implications for the transatlantic community and the notion of national sovereignty. Now, everyone speaking here today, and I'm sure most everyone watching this event will remember 2014 and know the details, Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea. This took half of Ukraine's coastline, 5% of Ukraine's landmass, 13,000 lives lost, another 30,000 or so wounded, heavy damage inflicted onto the Ukrainian economy. And this has been going on and off in terms of the fighting since 2014, mainly limited to eastern Ukraine and the Donbas region. But even though it's now been 7 years, we should not forget some fundamental points. Firstly, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. Russia illegally occupies Crimea. Russia provoked and now supports a Russian separatist movement in eastern Ukraine that did not previously exist. Russia is the aggressor here, and Ukraine is the victim. Modern Ukraine represents the idea in Europe that each country has the sovereign ability to determine its own path and to decide with whom it has relations and how and by whom it is governed. No outside actor, and in this case Russia, should have a veto on membership or closer relations with organizations such as NATO or the European Union. And it is in the NATO's and America's interest to ensure that Ukraine remains independent and sovereign and has the ability to choose its own destiny without the outside interference. Now, in terms of Russia's goals in Ukraine, there's been a lot of speculation, and Peter alluded to this, a lot of speculation as to what Russia was trying to achieve recently with its military buildup. There's been a lot of talk about the freshwater situation in Crimea. This has been discussed for a number of years. The canal that would feed Crimea fresh water has been cut off by the Ukrainians. So there's always been speculation that Russia would make a military move to access this fresh water. I am not so sure about this. I do see this being an issue for Russia, but as one observer pointed out of the recent Russian military exercise, it costs so much that they could have built the desalination plants in Crimea for what it cost. And also I'm not an expert on how canals work and how fresh water is delivered, but presumably if Russia entered southern Ukraine to access the canal, then the Ukrainians could simply cut off the flow of water further up the river. So unless Russia was willing to go all the way, which would be a very costly exercise, I don't think that the fresh water land grab was really a key factor. I think Russia's long-term strategic goal is to ensure that Ukraine remains out of the transatlantic community and is distanced from organizations like NATO and the European Union. Russia has perfected a formula, whether it's Russia or Georgia or Moldova, or Ukraine, Georgia or Moldova, to keep them out of the Euro-Atlantic community. And that formula is to invade and partially occupy. Because NATO and the European Union do not want to inherit the sort of conflict or frozen conflict, and Russia knows this. So basically, Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia are in the situation that they're in now because Russia wants to keep them out of NATO more than NATO wants to have them in the alliance. And until that changes, I'm afraid this will continue to be the case. Now, another plausible scenario that Moscow is hoping to achieve in eastern Ukraine is to help the so-called Russian-backed separatists to consolidate gains in Donetsk and Luhansk in order to create more of a political entity that functions more like a viable state. Now, this could include the capture of important communication and transit nodes, such as the city of Mariupol with its port and the Luhansk power plant, all of which are under the control of the Ukrainian government. And while this could be done in a piecemeal manner, such a move would eventually require a complete abandonment of any notion of a ceasefire. And the most aggressive scenario could involve Moscow attempting to reestablish control over the Novorossiya region of imperial times, which is located in the southern Ukraine. But again, with the fresh water scenario, I think this might be a bit much for Russia right now. This scenario would require Russia taking over both Mariupol and Odessa, which are Ukraine's 10th largest and 3rd largest cities, respectively, as well as a large-scale public mobilization of the Russian armed forces. And such a course of action by Russia would fundamentally change the geopolitical and security landscape in Eastern Europe in a way not seen since World War II. And also, the Ukrainian military is far more capable now and trained and equipped than it was in 2014. So this very aggressive scenario that I just outlined, I think is unlikely, and it would be very costly if Russia decided to undertake it. Now, what can we do about this? And I'll be concluding here, Peter. I think that the alliance, NATO, has an interest in helping Ukraine defend itself and helping Ukraine institute the necessary political and economic reforms. Ukraine right now, while trying to reform its governance, its judiciary, the security sector, the military, the economy, all while fighting a war against Russia in eastern Ukraine, is a bit like building a ship while you're already out at sea. And so anything that we can do to help Ukraine along this journey is important. So the easiest thing for us to do that costs very little is to speak with a clear and united voice. NATO must continue to present the united voice against Russian aggression, and NATO must continue to make very clear that as long as Ukraine wishes to join the alliance someday, that the open door is in fact open. And I think at the next NATO summit in June, it would be fantastic if the NATO-Ukraine Commission met at the head of state or head of government level. That would be a symbolic show of alliance commitment. The alliance needs to improve the quality of non-lethal support to Ukraine. The recent sale of US Javelin missiles to Ukraine is helpful, but NATO needs to improve non-lethal, secure communications, more capable UAVs. These are perhaps less sexier items, but equally important on the battlefield. We need to continue joint exercises with Ukrainian forces, and where possible, scale these up. And one thing I would like to see from a specific US point of view is maybe a loosening of some of the restrictions of US forces training Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper River. Right now, all of the training that the US carries out occurs almost 800 miles away from the front lines. I'm not saying US advisors and trainers need to get right on the front lines, but perhaps the occasional visit in an observer role would give the US trainers a better understanding on the needs and requirements of the Ukrainian armed forces. I think NATO needs to evaluate its trust funds for Ukraine. At the 2014 Wells Summit, NATO decided to vote some resources to establish 6 trust funds to focus on different items such as military medicine, like taking care of wounded soldiers, and counter IED, for example, capabilities. And I think we need to evaluate if these 6 trust funds are still relevant. I mean, take the counter IED one, for example. When was the last time a Ukrainian soldier in the static environment of almost trench warfare had to deal with IEDs? So it's not a conflict that's very fluid right now. So maybe the funding that's been trust fund could be better used for a new capability for the Ukrainian armed forces. And I would also like to see NATO open a NATO certified center of excellence on hybrid warfare in Ukraine. There is a center of excellence for hybrid warfare in Helsinki. It's not NATO certified. It only allows, as far as I know, my information could be slightly out of date, but it only allows EU members or NATO members to participate. There's no legal obstacle to preventing a center of excellence to be certified by NATO outside of a NATO member. And if you have a center of excellence on hybrid warfare, it only makes sense to include perhaps the countries that are at the tip of the spear against Russia's hybrid warfare, including Ukraine and Georgia. So I think it would be a great act of symbolism, if anything else, to explore possibilities of opening this in Kyiv or somewhere else in Ukraine. And then we need to step up our presence in the Black Sea. NATO needs to do more, find ways to spend more days in the Black Sea, help Ukraine improve its maritime domain awareness and its maritime capabilities. One proposal I've had is to try to create a Black Sea maritime patrol force, kind of based off the Baltic air policing, where countries would sign up in advance for a rotation on a rota to enter the Black Sea due to the restrictions of the Montreux Convention. And I think this would help maybe increase alliance presence in the sea. So those are just a few ideas, Peter. That was just my assessment on what I think Russia's trying to achieve and where we are today. So thank you.
That's great, Luke. And as usual, I find myself in violent agreement with huge parts of your talk. So thanks for that. And thanks in particular for the tangibles and specifics. Now to Brussels. David Cattler, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks for the generous introduction earlier. Look, it's always a pleasure to join a panel arranged by the Hudson Institute. And I look forward to this discussion and exchange of views with both my colleague Baiba and our friend Luke on this subject. So let me just use a couple minutes to shade in a little bit more detail to fill in some of the spaces that Luke covered. And then I think we can expand on the discussion of Russian motivations and what we think we can learn from all this. So beginning in late March and continuing through late April, the Russian Federation moved thousands of combat-ready troops and military equipment to Crimea and to several areas near Ukraine's border with Russia. These large deployments augmented the Russian units that were already stationed in the region. Without going into the exact numbers, we're talking about tens of thousands of additional troops in large concentrations in those locations. These deployments notably were unannounced, and they were conducted with an apparent effort to minimize their visibility when they left their home garrisons and as they transited to the areas near Ukraine. By early April, reports of very large road and rail movements were appearing in the media, and especially in social media. That does not necessarily suggest that Russia wanted to put this set of activities on display. Rather, with a military deployment of this size transiting these long distances over land, people inevitably observe such activity. This deployment, which has been said included land, naval, and air assets, was unusual in both its size and its timing. Russia steadily concentrated its forces on Ukraine's occupied Crimea Peninsula, where it also established a field hospital and provided other services that indicated that it might be getting ready, in fact, for some smaller scale combat operations. They also deployed to areas, as I said, near the Russia-Ukrainian border and conducted maritime deployments in the Black Sea region. In particular, the Russian military deployed motorized rifle troops, tanks, and artillery units to the Voronezh region, which is approximately 200 kilometers northeast of Ukraine. Open source reporting also noted the presence of long-range military communication systems that had come down with those troops. In addition, 4 Russian Raputia-class amphibious ships entered the Black Sea, which has been said joined more than 15 other warships. These amphibious ships are designed to transport troops and equipment. The Kremlin accompanied these naval deployments with an announcement that it intended to close off parts of the Black Sea through the end of October of this year. And finally, the Russian Federation deployed combat aircraft from Russian territory to occupied Crimea. This move added to the already high tensions, suggesting that Russia was taking yet another step to threaten and intimidate Kyiv. These large-scale deployments did not fit the profile for a routine exercise or training, and certainly are inconsistent with the patterns that we would have anticipated for this time in the Russian training cycle. And moreover, Russia was not at all transparent regarding its intentions. So on the 22nd of April, nonetheless, the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu indicated that that redeployment would be complete by the 1st of May, which did not happen. While Russian forces began to slowly withdraw, that redeployment is still ongoing now, more than halfway through the month of May. So this raises important questions, including the possibility that Russia might leave some additional forces and equipment permanently in the area. Look, I can't go into exact detail regarding what we observe the pace of this redeployment, but we're concerned that Russia may be trying once again to alter the status quo, which is a point I'll come back to at the end. The Kremlin has already said they plan to maintain some unspecified personnel and equipment and leave that behind, with some relation to their anticipated major annual exercise, Zapad, this fall. Russia still has not provided transparency regarding this deployment, nor its correlation with the exercise, nor have they explained the purpose or the number or the type of the sorts of troops that would remain in place. I note that Russia's also not lifted its announced blockage of foreign naval ships and state vessels in parts of the Black Sea, including near occupied Crimea and at the Kerch Strait. And Moscow announced that this blockage, specifically the Kerch Strait, would not end at least until the 31st of October, so spanning now for a 6-month period. And we should remember that Russia has a history of taking aggressive actions against Ukrainian vessels and impeding access to Ukraine's ports in the Sea of Azov, which impacts Ukraine's international commerce and does have a significant effect on the Ukrainian economy and energy supplies in Ukraine's east. We should also not lose sight of the unacceptable violence that's still ongoing in Donetsk and Luhansk. We should be mindful of frankly, the great increase in the rates of that violence, going to about 400 ceasefire violations per day, towards the peak of the Russian deployment in the region, as well as continued interference with the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, which still continues. Russia exploits this conflict to exert continued pressure on Kyiv. So the big question is, why did they do this? Many commentators and media pundits have explained the Russian behavior as a demonstration. We certainly hope that Russia does not and did not have more malign intentions towards Ukraine and the region. However, we must be very clear-eyed that the composition of this Russian force, including tanks, armored personnel carriers, combat aircraft, and short-range ballistic missile systems, certainly created the impression among some observers that Russia was mobilizing for an actual invasion, or at least that it sought to convey a credible invasion threat to Ukraine and to the West. So let's be clear. Russia amassed sufficient forces to conduct a limited offensive against Ukraine with minimal warning of attack once those forces were in position. If this had been intended as a demonstration, as some have suggested, I would have expected that Russia would have sought to strengthen its negotiating position on sensitive issues, such as increased autonomy for the Donbass, perhaps a meeting of the Normandy format. Moscow has pushed for direct dialogue between Kyiv and the Lugansk and Donetsk regions. It might also seek to demonstrate that it's prepared to assert its broader interests in Crimea and the broader Black Sea region. I think a point that's worth remembering here is that war is an extension of politics. So if the military was in place and ready to conduct some operation, there should have been a corresponding political objective. And my point here, to really emphasize, is that if it was a political objective that they sought all along, there were many other political avenues that could have been explored, short of making a very expensive and potentially risky deployment on this scale. Further, from an intelligence officer's perspective, I would remind that warning is important in my craft because it's a key part of what we do when crises emerge. But we should remember that warning directly affects risk, which is a key policy concern. Policy decides how much risk it wishes to assume, comes up with requirements for intelligence and security, comes up with its own stratagems and plans and contingencies, and is highly reliant on the time between the indications and warning provision and the time a decision and an action must be taken. I mean, frankly, that's what we call decision space. So if you've pre-staged, back to my point about changing, altering the status quo, I would argue that a sustained Russian presence like this on Ukraine's borders level sets at a higher level of force in the region and potentially a higher level of readiness than they had before, which means that they've then reduced warning in certain ways, which could in fact reduce the decision space. Time for consultations, time for consensus to be reached, time for coordinated action to be committed to and taken. And frankly, that adds instability and uncertainty in a region that is already fairly volatile and pressed in many illegal ways, as was mentioned by Luke as he went through his summary points. So either way, certainly these actions are not conducive to regional peace and security. It's very important to note that at the same time, Moscow had launched a disinformation campaign during the deployment and in the weeks before that sought to place blame on Ukraine for the current tensions, and potentially, as we saw at least one attempt, maybe even as a pretext to assert that the Ukrainians had invited some Russian military action upon themselves. I know Baiba will be well placed to expand on this element in our discussion, so let me now turn to you. Baiba.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks, Hudson Institute, for having us, and it's always a pleasure to work with you. We have had a number of joint projects, and it's always a success. Now, a couple of very short, very concrete points on what we saw during the month of April, and I will concentrate my remarks on that, was first that clearly there was a very well-targeted Russian propaganda effort. And it was targeted at the West, but for Russian home audiences. So what we saw was that everything that West did, be it around Navalny's health, be it against protesting against Russian movements around Ukraine, or be it around other issues, was presented as being very anti-Russian Western moves. So it was all tied together. We also saw that Russian propaganda targeted NATO and allies in particular, and that was very much around Ukraine and the moves around Ukraine. Similarly, we saw that type of use of NATO and sort of anti-NATO rhetoric last August, September, and a bit of October during Belarus protests and Belarus events. So we saw some similarities. This was not the case in 2014. So that is something different, which we can say is a tactic, for which strategies that is a different case. What we saw also, and that is interesting for us at NATO, was that these Russian targeted attacks did not get traction in our societies and in our media, in our information environment. Very little of Russian communications found any traction at all. However, what NATO and allies did and what Ukraine did and said was well reflected in our allied media, information space, and among the public perceptions. What we saw also was that after the Russian announcement of partial troop withdrawal, the communications also decreased, anti-NATO communications, anti-Western communications, but they turned to slightly different targets. They turned to what was happening in Afghanistan, They turned to NATO's exercises, the steadfast defender, and other issues. So both volume decreased, but also the targets decreased. As for the Russian publics, as I said, it was very much around presenting NATO as a hostile actor, presenting NATO as irresponsible, so nothing new there, but also very dehumanizing comms on Ukraine and Ukrainians. Almost, I would say in a slang, as warmongering communications. So what NATO does is pretty clear, as since 2014, there are several big lines of efforts. One is, of course, the deterrence and if necessary, defense around the 30. So that is a priority for NATO. So also in this situation, it was very clear. We did certain steps on the military side, on intelligence side, on comms side that needed to be done to increase awareness, collection, be ready in case situation deteriorates. Support to Ukraine, and again, is a very practical thing, whether it comes from the comms side, public diplomacy, strategic visits, but also Ukraine did very well in that respect this time. It showed itself as mature. It didn't react in any type provocatively. It had very clear communications. It reached out to all the political leaders. It was good. It was generally good. And also, we know that Ukrainian defense capabilities and their readiness has increased greatly. So it would in no case scenario be an easy type of situation if actually something more had developed. So in that respect, I think both Allied and NATO as organization support was there in political statements, but also in bilateral actions and supporting the institutions. Then, of course, the next point is increasing costs, increasing and imposing costs on Russia. So again, Russian destabilizing actions, it's not only around Ukraine, you saw around Navalny, you saw the Czech Republic came up with very clear situations that had been done in Bulgaria, so on and so forth. So again, that's a difficult one. What are the costs that you impose that are the right costs, and what instruments as the Western countries do we have? But certainly, again, both politically and economically, but also in terms of particular actions, they took place and they were taken. So what has changed with the NATO? Again, we have increased our awareness, and that's why my colleague David Cutler is here. The Joint Intelligence Division is a new one. Is a new division, and it was created as a result of needing to connect the dots, what the allies were saying, and actually increasing this awareness capability and intelligence capabilities that we together at 30 have. So that has helped, of course, NATO to be aware, agile, to be able to respond if necessary. Here at my public diplomacy division, which is coordinating strategic communications both across the military and the civilian sides of the house, we have invested quite a lot in terms of also situational awareness and understanding the information environment, and we are able to see it in live terms, what is actually happening and what is the reach, what is the depth of what is being done. But most of all, we have really invested in communications, in proactive, transparent, and very clear communications, because we believe the first thing that we need is to get our story to our audiences first, to our partners, but also to our adversaries. So that's why we communicate about what NATO does, be it on exercises, be it on our decisions, and be it on our mission as such. So that's in short where we are currently, and let's have a discussion in the time that we have left.
Great. Well, maybe I could stay with you, Madam Ambassador, with just a follow-up question, because you described the content of the message that Russia has pushed out, which is an anti-NATO, even warmongering message. But what are the mechanisms by which Russia operates? And I suppose this applies to them large globally, but specifically related to Ukraine. We know of the troll farms. There's the flagship Russia, rebranded Russia Today program? What are the kind of the tentacles or the avenues by which Russia seeks to shape Western audiences at the NATO member states?
Again, it depends on the country, it depends on the public, but you can see several layers of actions. One is, of course, the state-related and state-owned outlets. They very much shape what is the main sort of mainstream message or mainstream type of action that Russia wants to present as being communicated. Then, of course, you see sort of distantly or indirectly related second-tier sources that can be called in different ways. You know, they can be pretty legitimate outlets, mostly online outlets. They can be individuals. They can be bought insignificant outlets that are slowly being grown into something more serious. So that is a second sort of tier of disinformation or hostile or propaganda schemes that they are using. And then, of course, there is a whole set of other sort of pseudo sources that are used as, you know, fake individuals, artificial intellect created sources. There are also people who are used actually as presented as experts, even though they have nothing related to the country or to the source. So the whole spectrum of events, and that is why both the allies, but also here at NATO, we invest both in a variety of tools, both in terms of in-depth audience research, but also in terms of very practical tools, you know, monitoring both the sources and the reach and trying to understand how these comms are spreading. So it's the same for allies. Investing in our strategic communications capability is the same as investing in you know, ships or planes or rockets. We just need to do that, and that is both around technology, around the skills and the knowledge, and that has to be done. It's part of the resilience. It's part of ability to resist these type of attacks and developments.
And perhaps one more follow-up, if I could stay with you real quick. Since the alliance ranges from your home country all the way to Vancouver, I mean, it's a massive geographic scope with huge cultural and political and strategic even variations, one would say. Have you found it challenging to develop a common public diplomacy line on Ukraine? Are there big differences within the alliance that you encounter, or I suppose the anti-NATO message is easier to rebut than developing a pro-Ukraine one, or perhaps that's not right? What have you encountered on that front?
No, the allies have been very united, and also this time allies were very united. You saw the NATO-Ukraine councils that took place and the very strong statements that came out, and also very practical work that is happening with our Ukrainian colleagues. Ukraine is an enhanced opportunity partner. It's using a lot of these opportunities that are provided within that program. It's both around the capability building, around training, around joint exercises. But also, allies have found, in a number of cases, actually interesting to learn from Ukrainians, including what they have discovered, how the disinformation works, what sources are being used, and so on and so forth. So Ukraine, in that respect, is really an exemplary partner in collaborating with the allies and NATO. Again, you know, we have to be very clear about the fact that it's not anymore one main channel where the disinformation or influence is coming from. So we are in the times of emerging disruptive technologies, and we have to be really clear that it will be the whole society efforts for the allies, for NATO, but also for partners to be able to resist the negative and to counter these sort of trends that are undermining you. And for that, we need to invest. It's just pretty clear. We need to invest, educate, you know, get into our heads that the times are changing. This is a new normal. And whether that's cyber or disinformation, the whole hybrid toolkit and countering it is there.
Great, thank you. Secretary Cattler, if I could go to you. Take us inside your secret conversations with the Secretary General when you're advising him on intelligence and policy. Luke Coffey mentioned, and I think this is common opinion, at least in the Western press, that the Ukrainian armed forces are in a totally different place than they were 7 years ago. Do you share that assessment? What do you tell the Secretary General about the state of the Ukrainian military and where NATO can help make improvements and help shore up the Ukrainians? And don't worry, we won't tell anyone. It'll just be a little roundtable amongst us.
Yeah, that's a tough question the way you framed it. So let me just say, here's my view on that. Yeah, my experience with the Ukrainians has led me to agree with your central point, which is that they are a lot different in 2021 than they were in 2014. In no small part because they are very knowledgeable now of what the Russian tactics will be. A full frontal assault, you hope, is going to be the rarest of potential options. It's far more likely to be a hybrid operation that's run first in a political sphere, through strategic communications, through disinformation and misinformation, that has some sort of provocative trigger that gives an element of deniability, right? So you see this with the Russian deployments of Spetsnaz, you see it with Wagner and the other private military corporations with the intelligence service activities, and so on. The presence of the military is a very useful backstop and is a big threat. It can get a lot of attention. But I think, frankly, we should be even more concerned about the lower visibility things. I think that Moscow tries to do the best it can to understand how its opponents make their own decisions as well, try to reverse engineer our own processes. So I think we also need to be mindful that they're looking, no doubt, very closely at Kyiv's relationships with NATO and with the EU. They're trying to better understand what the decision points might be and how to undermine those, even as they think about, okay, where is Ukraine relative to us? Certainly the training that allies and even people outside the alliance have provided to the Ukrainians and the weapon systems have been provided make them a harder target. I agree with Baiba's point too, that I think the steadfast resolve, the maturity, the self-control not to be goaded into an action actually hostile to their own interests on the part of Kyiv is a great testament, not just to their readiness and maturity, but also, frankly, their resilience, the political and the military resilience. I'm sure that my colleagues in the Ukrainian military had a tough time on their hands to try to understand how do we prepare to defend ourselves in such a way that can't be mischaracterized as being overly provocative. Think about how absurd that is, too, for a second, right? Should I take the necessary steps to defend myself, to present a hard target, and risk being tarred with a brush that makes it seem as if I'm being aggressive? Some of the disinformation campaign that Baiba mentioned that was very useful, I think, intended to be useful for Russian domestic audiences, was very much focused on a set of statements that, in fact, the Ukrainians were massing force for an operation, if not to deal with the separatists in Ukraine's east, to actually attack Russia itself, which, again, is just completely absurd. But if that's the cause of war that you wish to highlight, then okay. Where does that leave us? I think the Ukrainians certainly need more mentorship. They need more training. They need more support. They need help with modernization, the software, not just the hardware. You know, the way in which we do business, the way governance works, civilian control of military, civilian control of the intelligence and security services, and so on. And I think, at least from my experiences with them, they're deeply knowledgeable of where the ball is in their court and what needs to be done. And I find them to be very clear-eyed about the challenges that they face within their own country from this invading force and illegally occupying force, about the subversion in the East, and about the risks that they face in the future.
It just occurred to me when you were speaking, there's this appreciation in the US, or I suppose I would even call it an emerging consensus, that we're moving away from NATO out of area, special operations type of warfare towards deterring great power conflict. And yet great power conflict in Europe looks a lot like many of the subversive tactics that exist in these gray zone conflicts, from the Wagner Group to Spetsnaz to other Russian modes of warfare that they're trying out and perfecting in areas like Ukraine. Perhaps, Luke, I could come to you with one more question. I know you thought a lot and traveled to Ukraine yourself. What is your feeling for the on the ground kind of Ukrainian sensibility? I heard an interesting anecdote related to me. A friend of mine who visited with a Ukrainian officer told him if he ever met Vladimir Putin, he would pin a medal on his chest because no one has done more for Ukrainian nationalism and cohesion and identity than Vladimir Putin. Is there a toughness to the civic society there? Is this a country that's under siege, but at the same time toughening? How should we as Americans sitting thousands of miles away think about Ukrainian society and people?
Thanks, Peter. From my experience, the Ukrainians proved to be very resilient. They're a very resilient people. They have a very robust civil society. NGO communities flourish, think tank communities flourish compared to some of the other regional countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So I do feel like they have a robust and honest debate domestically about many of these issues. And going back to my point earlier about the readiness and capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces now compared to 2014, the morale is higher. There's better when you're trained well, when you're equipped well, and when you're fed well, morale is usually high. And I think that's the case right now in Ukraine, certainly in Eastern Ukraine on the front lines. And there's a certain, speaking to Ukrainians in Kyiv, walking down the street, they say you hear less Russian being spoken than before, more Ukrainians being used, especially by the younger population, English as well, being taught more. So there is definitely an emerging generation that sees their future as being more aligned with the Euro-Atlantic community. And that's really the stark difference between the US and even NATO position and Moscow's position. Our position is this is a matter for the Ukrainian people. And as long as they want to join the alliance, as long as they want to be part of the Euro-Atlantic community, then the door is open and we will help you along the way. However, if you choose in a democratic fashion not to join or not to get closer to the Euro-Atlantic community, that's fine. We will still work with you where we can and have a strong and robust bilateral relationship. From the Kremlin's point of view, that there's one way, and that is in Russian-aligned and Russian-backed organizations and coziness with the Kremlin. And that's the stark difference. And I think Ukrainians see that and they understand that. And they sort of resent this patronizing attitude taken by Russia towards their country.
Thanks. And let me conclude by going back to Secretary Cattler with a question. I know you all are very busy and need to move on to your next meeting. So let me actually ask about that. Some of our viewers are not steeped in NATO operations, steeped in the transatlantic security community. So perhaps you could tell us what happens when a buildup like this takes place at NATO headquarters. How does NATO headquarters and the operation you and the ambassador run relate to, for example, SACEUR headquarters? How does NATO in Brussels actually function?
So look, I just say briefly that NATO is a politico-military alliance. And so, as Baiba said when she spoke, a large part of my role here is to help the nation's intelligence and security services come together at 30 is the term of art, meaning that the alliance with its 30 members has the information that it needs to consult and reach a decision or consensus, whatever is necessary. So I should point out here that there are more than 75 intelligence services within the alliance and more than 110 when we get out to the partners included. So it is a big and highly capable, I love the job, frankly, for the challenges and for that set of capabilities. So generally speaking, what's going to happen is we will do our job and provide the early warning. We will help improve situational awareness. We will issue assessments. We'll do that in both military and in civilian senses for both political and for military decision-making and action to be considered. The SACEUR will follow under his authorities the procedures that he must in order to better understand an emerging situation, raise readiness as necessary, raise the military warning level. We will give input along with the other divisions here at headquarters, whether public diplomacy, political affairs, operations, etc., so that the NAC and the military committee can make their decisions as to whether they wish to convene and what issues they wish to take up. As I think you highlighted and Baiba highlighted, there was a meeting of the NATO Ukraine Council as well, which is no small thing, frankly. Foreign Minister Kuleba came in and spoke on President Zelensky's behalf, conveyed Ukraine's position on behalf of the president. So these are the things that we see. This is what's on our mind. I think in the House, you're all greatly facilitated by the work that the international staff and the international military staff and the nation's delegations themselves do to crosstalk, work with Ukraine and work with others in the international community to understand. They reach consensus, they make a decision, and then activities are pursued and actions are taken. So as Baiba said, you saw increased NATO intelligence collection, you saw NATO statements, and you saw statements from the nations themselves that were very clear, frankly, and very early, rewardingly early in this buildup from the head of state level and at the ministerial level, and from here as well in Brussels and from the EU, to all be on the same page and communicate to Moscow that this had not gone unnoticed, that there was cause for concern, not for alarm, but cause for concern, and that there would be a discussion and that there could be consequences if further military action were taken vis-a-vis another sovereign state, as it had been in this case in 2014 and sadly in times since. So I think in a nutshell, that's how things generally work here. There's a lot that has to happen in order to sustain that, because again, remember, you're working across, Baiba and I and others here, charged with working across not just many divisions within this headquarters, but with 30 nations, each of us with different constituencies, strategic communications, with intelligence and security, military operational elements, chiefs of defense, heads of state, ministers, and so on, to ensure that first and foremost, they have the same sight picture. They have a common lexicon, they have a strong basis for debate at 30, that we work together to raise that level of debate by providing the best information and advice that we collectively can, whether diplomacy, intelligence and security, policy, operations. The nations make and reach decisions at 30, and then the alliance moves. And I think, frankly, in this case, very well done in order to get that message out, to present some good resolve, to bolster Kyiv as appropriate. And I think there's plenty left to finish here, as I said when I made my opening remarks, but I think the alliance worked and performed as it should.
Well, that's a great, go ahead, Ambassador.
On my side, just one more point to what David said. Really, I mean, the commitment to the allied deterrence and defense, to helping Ukraine, other partners is huge. It's really fantastic, how united the alliance is around that. And also the lessons learned and what NATO has done after 2014, such as creating this new division on JSD, really has helped in terms of assessing threats and creating this more understanding and united joint threat assessment among the allies, which again is the basis for joint action as the next step. So overall, there is never a perfect place, but the alliance is doing well. And the task is, of course, to prepare for the future, because when we think the changes that the artificial intelligence, big data is bringing to the military side of the house, but not only military, also to the intelligence, to the communications, to everything. This is the big task that we have to prepare for, and we call it NATO 2030, and it applies to everything that we do.
Well, thanks to both secretaries for joining us today. You're always welcome in Washington for a live event, travel permitting. Thanks for keeping us safe. I think I also speak for Luke Coffey, saying he also would be happy to host you sometime at Heritage or Hudson. And thanks, Luke, for joining us. It's really great to hear expertise. Join us again for another event in the future to talk about transatlantic security. And thanks very much for joining us today.